Okay, I did want to point out one quick thing before we get started in lecture. So I just switched my screen over here. In the Blackboard site for the course under supplemental material, let me change this. There's PowerPoint presentations where, again, you can find the Chapter 2 PowerPoint that I did just post in chat also. I also added a tab for Excel files. And here we have a couple of Excel files that we're going to be using maybe today, maybe next time for the demo. So these are the 3 Excel files we'll be using. They are on Blackboard also. Okay. And then just give me a second here while I get all my tabs sorted out with the PowerPoint and all of that. Okay. So the quote of the day for today is from my favorite grad school professor who is now retired. It was my favorite professor at Pitt, University of Pittsburgh. And he said that good decisions come with experience, and experience comes from making bad decisions. So kind of, unfortunately, the only way to, get to a point where you're making good decisions is by making bad decisions. And I think this is a really interesting quote because it lines up a little bit with like that Einstein saying that, something about like, if you've never failed, then you've never tried, or something like that, right? In other words, when something goes wrong, you kind of have maybe one of 2 choices that might be a little bit of a false dichotomy, but roughly speaking, you can either say, oh, that was terrible, I'm never going to try that again. And I think sometimes with math, some people approach it that way. They, didn't do well in a previous course or something, and then they have, kind of an anxiety about math, and they say, oh, I just want to, do as little of it as I can. I want to avoid it whenever possible. I'm going to push it to the very end of my degree and, try to avoid it as long as possible. Or you can say, okay, let's look back and see what made that a bad experience and see what we can learn from that and maybe make the next go a better experience. So maybe in, a course like stats or higher level courses, maybe that's less of an experience for you. But I think definitely in the lower levels, that's something that people experience a lot. And I think, folks in stats and even higher level math maybe have had some of that experience in the past or perhaps even recent past. So when you quote make a bad decision, or when in general something doesn't go the way you want it to go, if you use it as a learning experience, I think that's a much more positive outlook. Same thing like if you invest money in the market or something and you end up losing money, if you're if you're trying to come up with like trading schemes or something like that, if you're trying to make extra money in the market and you're viewing it just as kind of a fun thing, if you're viewing it for your retirement, go with somebody, go with a professional and let them do it for you. But if you're just having some fun, if you lose a bunch of money, don't just pull all your money out and stuff it under the mattress. Say, okay, well, I can use this as a learning experience. I lost some money, but can I gain some knowledge and information that I can then leverage in the future? Okay, and then as I mentioned, we're going to continue working on the Chapter 2 PowerPoint. We'll shoot to finish it up today. We might not get all the way to the end of it, or we might get to the end of it and start the Excel introduction. All right. So we left off here last time. So one more chance. Are there any questions on anything from last time? Any of the Chapter 2 PowerPoint from last time? Any of the homework? Okay, so in chapter 2, we're talking mainly about graphical descriptive techniques. So we're talking about descriptive statistics where we have a bunch of raw data and we're trying to crunch it down into maybe say one number that I can convey to you that maybe gives up a little bit of nuance, but is much more understandable for the user. Or maybe I'm trying to create a graph, a picture that is much more understandable to the person viewing that. So the first step we mentioned to getting to that point was to organize the data. We have raw data. Typically, we can't go straight from raw data to a picture. We have to do kind of an intermediate step. And that intermediate step is often creating a frequency distribution. So creating a chart that has a series of classes, a series of bins, I often call them, along with the frequency or the count, the number of data points that have value that belongs to that bin. We create a frequency distribution, and then from there, we often will go and create our chart, maybe a histogram or something like that. We talked about a couple of different types of charts, and we'll talk about some more today. But before we go much further, I would like to talk about distribution shapes. So if we imagine that we have our raw data, we put it into a frequency distribution, we get, say, a histogram, maybe a line chart, something like that, out, and we look at the shape. If I was looking at a shape in front of me, if I was looking at this picture and we were on the telephone and I wanted to describe to you what the picture looks like, there are some words that I might use to describe it. So I might use words like bell-shaped or bimodal or uniform, or on the next slide, right or left skewed. So let's just talk about what each of these words or phrases means, and maybe some examples. And as an aside, I've kind of mentioned this before, when I'm in kind of full screen mode like this, where I'm just sharing my whole screen, if you're saying things in chat, I don't have the chat up just because I don't have the window space for it. So if you have questions or want to add anything, feel free to just kind of unmute yourself and speak up. But okay, so starting with bell-shaped. So bell-shaped is characterized by being symmetric, peaked in the middle, and tailing off to the side. So to draw it as something like a perfect line graph, it might look like this. I mean, perfect to the limits of my drawing capabilities, which are certainly not perfect. Or if we imagine, a histogram coming from maybe real data, it's not going to line up perfectly with this bell shape, but it should be pretty close, right? Something like this, we should definitely see that clear peak in the middle. And we should see a tailing off to both sides. Peak in the middle, tailing off to both sides. And it's symmetric in the sense that if I drew a vertical line down that peak, if I imagine flipping my distribution over that line, it would look roughly the same. Same as over here, if I drew a vertical line down this peak and then flipped my distribution about that line, it would look roughly the same. So bell-shaped distributions are actually really, really important. Sometimes these are also called normal. Sometimes Gaussian, named after Carl Friedrich Gauss, a mathematician. So normal distributions, Gaussian distributions, bell-shaped distributions all kind of mean the same thing. This picture here, where we have a symmetric distribution, if I flip it over some vertical axis, it looks the same. It has a peak in the middle, tails off to the sides. Now we're going to see in chapter 6 that this is actually an incredibly important distribution. This is really kind of what enables essentially all of chapters 7 and 8. There's an important theorem called the central limit theorem. And roughly speaking, what it says is if I average together a lot of small influences, my end result looks like this, looks like a bell-shaped distribution, right? So if you imagine that maybe a person has a lot of different contributions to, say, their height, maybe their parents' heights, maybe the different genetic factors, maybe nutritional factors. There's maybe a lot of small influences to an individual's height. So if I measured a whole bunch of people's heights, since their height is kind of an aggregate or kind of an average of lots of small influences, I would expect those heights to follow something like a normal distribution. So for instance, heights of people. Now, that being said, there is one factor that greatly influences heights. So male versus female, men tend to be, substantially taller than females. So heights for, let's say, men, or heights for women. So because there's one factor that has a substantial effect, but then lots of other factors that have a minor effect, and they kind of just get averaged together. If we if we stratify on that substantial effect, if we look at men separately from women, then amongst the men, we'd expect a normal distribution. Amongst the women, we'd expect a normal distribution of heights. Again, because within each of those strata, this is something that's the effect of, or the result of the effects of lots of small influences. So we actually see a lot of kind of physical characteristics following a normal distribution. So things like IQ, things like intelligence, again, something that's going to be related to just a ton of small influences. And the list really kind of goes on. If you think of most physical traits that aren't dominated by a specific factor, it's probably going to follow a normal distribution, right? So this is one that comes up quite often and is very important later on in the course. There's also this idea of bimodal, where we have two peaks in a distribution. So, a line graph of a very clear bimodal distribution might look something like this. Or something from real world data. Maybe something like that. And typically when I think of a bimodal distribution, I usually get the feeling that it often comes from two normal distributions that are kind of overlapping one another. So classic example might be like heights of the general population. Well, because we have one kind of dominant factor that separates folks by height, male versus female. So this is going to be kind of the female distribution, this the male distribution. But if I just kind of aggregate all of them together and look at heights, I kind of am mixing two different normal distributions, two different bell-shaped curves with different locations of their peaks. So I usually think of that as what's giving me a bimodal distribution. Often things like, say, grades, these can often be bimodally distributed. There are the students who, put in a real solid effort and they tend to get kind of in the ABC range. And then there are the students who maybe aren't taking the class quite as seriously and they tend to score a little bit lower. So there tend to be two distinct strata. Excuse me. I hope in something like stats, it's not quite so extreme, but in some courses it is, particularly the lower level courses. We see a little bit more of that, folks who take the course more seriously or less seriously, and we do tend to see those strata kind of separate, and we tend to see more bimodal distributions in those grade data. And then uniform, a distribution that is straight across or flat. What might this look like in an actual histogram? Maybe something like that. Actual data is never going to perfectly align with, uh, with one of these distribution shapes, or even with its underlying distribution, a concept that we'll kind of talk about in starting in maybe chapter 4 or 5. But real world data is a little messy, but we can see that it doesn't seem like there's really a distinct peak or valley or anything like that in this data. Up here we saw kind of a distinct peaking and valleying structure, and same with up here. This was pretty distinct. But here, I mean, it would be kind of tough to call this a real valley or to call this a real kind of downward slope, just because of the magnitude, just because of the size of the differences. Uniform distributions probably most commonly come up, at least at least in the way that we'll use them in this course, in things that are man-made, that are meant to be equally likely. So for instance, the roll of a six-sided die. So if I have six-sided dice, I kind of expect that if I pick one up and I roll it, it's going to come up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 with approximately equal likelihood. If I rolled a six-sided die, 100 times, I'm not going to get exactly 1/6, 1s, 2s, 3s, 4, 5s, and 6. That's, first of all, that's mathematically impossible because 6 doesn't divide into 100. But even if it did, even if I had 120 rolls where it could divide nicely, it's very unlikely I'm going to get exactly 21s, 22s, and so on. But I'm probably going to get somewhere in the ballpark of 21s and somewhere in the ballpark of 22s and so on if I did that. So things like six-sided dice, things like the number that comes up on a roulette wheel, heads or tails, flipping a coin, those kind of things tend to be, uniformly distributed, or at least approximately uniformly distributed. Also, in birth rates, things like male versus female also tends to be approximately uniformly distributed. Approximately 50-50 shot of having a boy or a girl when you have a kid. Any questions on these 3 distribution shapes? Okay, and then the next 2 have to do with this idea of skewedness. So skewedness is kind of the opposite in some sense of symmetry. When there is evidence of skewedness, that means that there is a lack of evidence of symmetry. So skewedness stands contrary to symmetry. And skewedness has to do with this idea called outliers. So let's just take a really quick detour and talk about what's an outlier. An outlier is, at this point, we're just going to simply say a data point that doesn't seem to fit in with the rest of the data. Now, admittedly, that's quite a subjective statement, but we're kind of, building up some ideas here. When we get to chapter 3, we'll have some more objective ways of looking for outliers. But we're just kind of getting some of this terminology figured out at this point. So at this point, we're okay with dealing with some subjectivity. So an outlier is a data point that doesn't fit in with the rest of the data. So for instance, if I had a graph that looked like this, and here I'll start with the histogram version. So I see basically all of the data in my data set is in this general area. And then maybe I have like one data point over here and one data point over here. These, I think most folks would agree that these 2 data points kind of don't seem to fit in with the bulk of the data, which is over here. So we would probably label these outliers. Now, outliers, we can think of outliers as being far away from where most of the data are. I could have outliers, say all or mostly to the right. I could have outliers all or mostly to the left, or I could have outliers kind of split on both sides. I would call my distribution right skewed if my outliers are either all or mostly to the right. And by to the right, I mean in the direction that is the positive direction on the axis. So it is important here that we're thinking of this as being this data at least having the structure of being ordered. So if this was just, a histogram representing people's preferences for certain beverages, and, there happened to be a bunch of beverages in here that nobody really liked, and I happen to line them up this way, there's no natural ordering or ranking there. We wouldn't really want to talk about skewedness in that context. So we're thinking of quantitative data where we can at least impose a natural ordering. So in other words, when I order the bins in their according to their natural ordering, and then I make a graph off of that frequency distribution, I see that that graph has a couple of data points that are way off to the right of where the bulk of the data is. So again, to be right skewed, two important criteria have to hold. One is that there exist outliers, that there exist data points that don't fit in with the bulk of the data. And two, that those outliers are all or mostly to the right side of the bulk of the data. If I don't have any outliers, I can't be skewed in either direction. If I have outliers, but they're on the left side or they're split, then I'm not right skewed. So the direction of skewedness is the direction of the outliers. As a line graph, it might look something like this. Often these skewed distributions kind of look normal for a bit, but then they have kind of a big long tail on one side. So here, note that the left tail, the left side kind of goes to zero pretty quickly, but the right tail takes a really long time. It goes to zero very slowly. So there are some distributions like this, like say the exponential distribution or the chi-square distribution or the, I think those are the main two that we'll deal with. The F distribution we'll see a little bit at the end of the course, but not very much. But we would say those are right skewed distributions. Whereas the normal distribution is this kind of bell-shaped distribution, right? We might say that it has some outliers. Normal distribution, probably not, but if it did, they would be symmetric. There would be outliers on both sides. But here we have outliers and they're all to one side, or maybe we have one outlier on the left, but 5 on the right, right? All are mostly to the right. So what's some examples of, what are some examples of right skewed distributions? Well, the kind of most famous one is something like income. So average annual income, that does tend to be right skewed. So most folks kind of make, let's say, somewhere in the ballpark of like 40 to 100,000 a year, but there are some people like, Elon Musk or Bill Gates or somebody that are way over here to the right. So income tends to be right skewed. And therefore, things directly related to income also tend to be right skewed. So things like, say, wealth or net worth maybe tend to be right skewed. Things like, house prices tend to be right skewed. So, the folks who are all the way over here, like, Bill Gates, he's going to want a really expensive house with all kind of fancy gadgets in it. His house, so therefore house prices are going to be right skewed because the people with the higher incomes want those expensive luxuries. Or car prices, most people drive a Ford, a Toyota, something like that, but some people drive Bentleys. So that's probably the most famous example of right skewedness. And then again, why are we going through all of this worry about distribution shapes and so on. Well, one thing that we'll see in chapter 3, and I'll just touch on it really briefly here. If you don't really get this, that's fine. We'll revisit it in chapter 3, go into more detail. If I want to report, say, a measure of center to you, if I want to report what's a number to you that's the typical data point, you might think, okay, I'll just report to you average income. But it turns out that when we have skewedness, a lot of times if I report an average to you, it's a little misleading. Maybe not intentionally, but it's a little misleading because these folks on the right here pull that average way off to the right. I would really like, if I say, what's a typical data point look like in this data set? I'd like something, in this ballpark here, but these kind of outliers far off to the right, you can almost think of them as like a lever arm, that the lever is really long. So a little bit of weight way out has a disproportionate effect. So the average might be like here. Does this look like a typical data point, a location of a typical data point? Not really, but it's just the effect of those outliers. So maybe I would report something like, say, a median instead of an average. That might get me a measure of center that's a little more in line with what I might say is like a typical data point. So oftentimes, if you look up income data or if you see it reported by, say, Bureau of Labor Statistics or a place like that, a lot of times they'll report what's the median income instead of the average income for that exact reason, because these tend to be right skewed. Left skewed is kind of just the opposite. So here we would have a bunch of data kind of all in one general region, and then we'd have some outliers to the left. So again, we need two things to consider a distribution left skewed. We need to have outliers in the first place. We need to have some data points that seem to not really fit in with the rest. And they need to all or mostly be on the left side. And again, with those same caveats that I mentioned before, we need to have a natural order and ranking here. We need to be respecting that natural order and ranking in the frequency distribution of the graph and all of that. So left skewed, where we have outliers to the left, probably the most famous example of left skewed. It's a little harder to come up with left skewed examples than right skewed, but something like age at death, it might be an example of a left skewed distribution. Most people, let's say, die, between 60 to 90-ish years old, somewhere in that rough ballpark. Some people die very young, right? Accidents or diseases or something. You could have somebody that dies at 10 years old or even a 1-year-old, say, 60 or 70 years below what you might otherwise expect. But there's not really anybody up here at 140 years old, right? There's not really anybody to balance that out on the extreme old age end of the spectrum. So we have left outliers. We have some folks who die quite young, most folks who die kind of in this rough ballpark of the senior age group, let's say, but we don't really have the other extreme to balance out that group of left outliers. So we might call this a left skewed distribution. Okay, are there any questions on distribution shapes? All right, so moving into other types of graphs. So a time series graph, this is like a bar chart, a line graph, a histogram, something like that, where we have bins with frequencies, and then we make bars or we make dots and connect them with lines. Similar type of graphical technique, but here our variable, or what determines the bins, is time. So in this case, I have a graph of major airline accidents from a previous textbook for the course. And, one bin is 1997. The accident occurred in 1997. Another bin is 98, another bin 99, and so on. And I have my raw data, which are the dates of the airline accidents. And I see that there were 2 accidents in 97, 0 in 98, 2 in 99, 3 in 2000, etc. So this is what we would call a time series graph. And you might say, why don't we just call it a histogram? Well, I mean, it is kind of a histogram, but the thing is that in time series, there are a lot more complexities that tend to arise. So there's a lot more challenge with modeling things that are time series like this, typically anyway. So kind of just having that a little bit separate in our minds, this is one of the reasons why finance and things like predicting the stock market or predicting interest rates or predicting whether the Fed is going to, raise or lower the rate or keep it the same. That's why those can be quite hard to predict, at least in part because they're time series, and also in part because the predictions affect human behavior, and human behavior is what determines whether those things happen, whether the market goes up or down, or whether the rate goes up or down. So there's also kind of more feedback into the system that predictions affect behavior, and behavior affects the thing you're trying to predict. So that's another reason for that. So you can take entire courses in statistical modeling just for time series, and there's all kind of really interesting and elegant math that goes into trying to model these things. But for instance, just to give you one idea of some of the complexities of time series, if you imagine something like, let's say, car sales or house sales, these tend to be cyclic. Right, going from summer to summer, more car sales, more house sales, typically in the summers than in the winters. There are busier months and lighter months, or maybe in retail sales, maybe around Christmas is a busier time, and in January, February is a slower time, right? There's this cyclicity in the sense that if I took this whole graph, remember when I was talking about the normal distribution and I said, if we flip the graph over an axis, it looks the same. We said that's symmetry. So that's a kind of mirror symmetry. But here we have a translational symmetry. If I took the whole graph and shifted it over one peak, so if I started here, shifted it over, it would follow a very similar progression. So this is something called autocorrelation, where the data kind of looks like itself, but shifted over a little bit. So this is, for example, one of the complexities that tends to come up in time series that we don't tend to see as much in things like, histograms, where the bins are, things like, say, wealth level or something like that, or income level, or, dice rolls, or heights, or something like that, right? We tend to see more of this, say, for instance, seasonality, this cyclicity in time series, as well as several other things that come up in time series. But just to give you a little bit of a flavor of some of the complexities that are more likely to occur in something like time series than in another example. An example of a time series graph. This is a picture from Gallup polls. They actually, as far as I know, they stopped publishing this. I don't know if they stopped publishing it for free and maybe it's behind a paywall, or if they stopped publishing it altogether, but I always like to look at this graph, and then, several years back, it just stopped being at the page that it used to be at, and I couldn't find it anywhere. So this is a graph of, you can see at the top here, the legend, unemployment is this dark green line at the bottom, but also underemployment is this slightly lighter green line. The very light green line at the top is payroll to population, but underemployed is a really interesting one, right? We can see that it tracks pretty closely with unemployment, like this little spike here. We also see an unemployment, but unemployment can be a tricky number because, well, there are, government constraints on unemployment. You can only apply for unemployment for so long. Once your unemployment runs out, if you had a job as a manager making a good money, mid-career or something, you're going to look for a job as a manager making good money. But if your unemployment runs out and you haven't really had luck, you might be willing to accept something lower than what you were doing before, or something that, doesn't completely use your degree or something like that, that's maybe not in the same career field. And those folks would be underemployed. So sometimes you'll see, the government folks touting like, oh, we got unemployment down. Okay, but what happened to underemployment? Did underemployment stay the same, or did underemployment go down as well? And that's an important question to ask. But we can see this time series graph here. At each date, we have, based on a survey that Gallup did, a number for percentage of people who are unemployed, underemployed, and so on over time. Another example of a time series graph is, say, the S&P 500 stock market data. Each date, we have the value of the S&P 500 at the close of the market that day, and we can plot it on a picture like this. And if you look at this, this goes from, say, ballpark of early, maybe 2007 to say ballpark of mid 2015. So that's about 8 years, 250 trading days a year, 252, but we'll just call it 250. So this is about 2,000 data points. If I just handed you a piece of paper with 2,000 numbers on it, you'd look at that and say, this doesn't tell me anything. But I can plot 2,000 data points on a picture, make it a line graph, and you can see a lot from this. You can see, okay, it's, in short intervals of time, the market's a little rocky, but it tends to kind of follow a trend. It was going down a little bit here. It was generally going up here. There were some times, like, say, mid 2011, where we had a little bit of a drop off, but then it kind of recovered. And then you can see the housing market crash back here. You can see we had a big drop off stuck down there for a little while, and then it started a kind of general trend of a slow and steady recovery. I can glean a lot of information. I can glean a lot of maybe even knowledge, maybe even understanding of what happened, or modeling of what might happen, say, in the near future, from a picture like this, relative to what I could get from a list of 2,000 numbers. And this is just the same picture on just a slightly different method of presentation. So here we have the value of the S&P up here, and we also have split apart the trading volume. So how much trading was going on each of these days. And we see during the crash, there was a little more trading going on than maybe during the recovery. People were more eager to, say, get out of their investments or to pick up new investments for cheap than maybe during the recovery, when it was just kind of slow and steady. And this is just a little joke. Time series graph for over time. What's the chance that a word that I type, say, as a programmer, will start with a weird symbol? Well, these languages at the top here, or languages, or methods of tagging things, start with funny symbols, and these ones at the bottom are a little more like plain language. So, was there a question?
Yeah, I was curious, like, say you wanted to measure something real subjective, like I see economists do like a happiness index or utility or something like that. What kind of would that be on like a time series graph, or would that be a different, or is it just up to whatever?
Yeah, it would depend on how they're measuring it. So if they wanted to say, I have a group of 10 people, it doesn't so much matter whether it's subjective. But if I have, let's say, this group of 10 people, and I'm going to call each of them and say, on a scale from 0 to 10, how happy are you today? And then I do the same thing tomorrow, and then I do the same thing the next day, and the next day. Right? Maybe that's cyclic, because maybe people are happier on the weekend. I don't know. So that would be a time series. If I just, said, okay, I'm just curious, I'm going to call 1,000 people today, just right now. I'm going to call 1,000 people, ask them, how happy are you? Scale was 0 to 10. They tell me, And then I make my frequency distribution and I make a histogram from that, this would not be a time series chart. So for a time series chart, time is the important variable. So I'm trying to track a certain thing over time and then charting that. So for something like, say, happiness, it is very subjective. But as far as the charting, it's no different from if I use something very objective like an S&P 500 value. Everybody agrees on what this value is on a certain day. At least I presume everybody does. I don't think there are any, S&P, whatever conspiracy theorists. Maybe there's probably someone out there, but so because I'm measuring the same thing over and over, day to day or month to month or whatever, and then charting that's a time series graph. If I just said like today, take a snapshot at the end of the business day today, look at all of the stocks in the NYSE, New York Stock Exchange, and break them into bins, stock price between 0 and 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, that would not be a time series graph because there's no element of time there. So subjectivity versus objectivity doesn't affect what type of graph we use or what we would call that graph. It's really whether we collect the same data periodically over time, or whether we take kind of a snapshot in time and then present that data. Now, that being said, like, you do bring up a good point that something like, say, happiness or something like that, particularly these like psychological things, are going to be more subjective in a sense than say objective things like the S&P, or maybe even unemployment, right? So unemployment is going to be pretty objective, like you either are unemployed or you're not, according to some definition from the government. But maybe underemployment, maybe that's subjective, right? Do I think that the job that I'm working now is lower than what I should have gotten, or it's worse than what I did have previously? That might be a little subjective, depending on how they define things, how they ask the questions, and so on. So what this would make me think of is I'd be a little more trusting in these numbers. I'd be a little more trusting that whatever fundamental thing about reality I'm trying to understand with this data, this is probably going to get me closer to that fundamental reality. It's kind of closer to the machinery in a sense than something that's subjective, where there's kind of a human interpretation in the middle, or there's more human interpretation in the middle. If I try to make a statement, if I try to generalize to a bigger population or something, it might be harder to do with more subjective data. So I think that's maybe something I could say about that. But as far as whether it's considered time series or not, that really depends on, how they're collecting the data, and less about how subjective or objective it is. Okay, any other questions before we go to the next topic? All right, so I think everybody has seen a pie chart at some point in your life, or a pie graph. And the idea here is that you look at this circle down here. This was something that IT used to send us. They haven't sent these to us in a long time. I don't know if we switched to a different system or what. Or maybe people just got annoyed with them sending these to it. I don't know. I thought it was cool to see these though. I have up here some numerical information. Say, what was the spam or whatever that was filtered out? What was the high level of spam, medium level of spam? I guess that's probably in terms of danger. How many emails contained viruses, and so on, what percentage. So first I note that down here next to the pie graph, I'm talking in terms of percentages. So I'm talking in terms of relative frequencies. And the goal of a pie graph is to represent these relative frequencies with proportionate areas of the pie. So for instance, I see this blocked connections. I guess this is where somebody tried to visit a site from an email and the spam filter said, no, you shouldn't be clicking on that. Like, don't visit that site. That was about 29%, say in the ballpark of a quarter. And I see that that yellow slice of the pie is again in the ballpark of a quarter. Same with dark and light blue, the high and medium spam that is filtered out, each of those in the ballpark of a quarter, 25%. And we see that reflected in the pie chart. We see that bulk messages and legitimate, so, false positives, the spam filter said, hey, I think this is spam. And the user came in and said, no, that's actually a good message. That's somewhere 16, 17%. So again, that kind of makes up most of the rest of the graph between those two, about equally split. So instead of looking at all of these numbers and trying to, make these kind of generalizations, I can really easily look at the picture and say, okay, yellow, light blue, and dark blue each represent about a quarter. Pink and green each represent about half of what's left, or half of the remaining quarter ballpark. I can tell that much more quickly on the picture than looking at all of these different numbers. So that's the idea of a pie graph. What's the downside of a pie graph, at least kind of a simple one like this? Well, how many messages did it actually filter out? Did it, filter out 100 messages or 1,000 or 10,000? Maybe I'm interested in that, right? If I want to know, is my server capacity big enough? I don't really care so much about the proportions. I care about the actual volume. If I have to filter 100,000 messages, I need more computing power than 10,000. Here's this was from a report from Rasmussen polls, who they're kind of like Gallup. They usually do a very good job. Unfortunately, this report, they didn't do such a great job. And the whole purpose of using graphical techniques is for the person to be able to look at it quickly and make kind of an instant like gut feeling, or have an instant gut feeling understanding of what's going on, and have that be right. Now you look at this, and I think it's actually more confusing than anything. Are you happy with your job? Lots of people say yes. Are you worried about losing your job? Well, why is my blue so much smaller over here than over here? Blue is yes in both cases. But they've kind of like switched the, switched the parity in a sense of the question. So like most people that are happy with their job are not going to be worried about losing their job. And most people that are worried about losing their job are not going to be very happy with their job. So blue represents yes in both cases. They have one histogram and one pie graph. I don't see that there's any real problem with that, but since they switched the kind of positive negative of the question, people that are happy with their job tend to not be worried about losing it, and vice versa. It's kind of confusing, right? I would expect to see, okay, there's a lot of yeses, a lot of blue on the left. I'd expect to see a lot of blue on the right. If I have to look at this, get confused, really dig into it and try to understand it, you could have just given me 4 numbers, right? You could have just said, are you happy with your job? Yes, no, and give me the percents. And then, are you worried about losing your job? Yes, no, and give me the percents. And I don't see that the graphical techniques really do much help here. And the problem is that blue is kind of associated with something positive in the left side and something negative in the right side. So even though blue stands for yes in both cases, it's kind of meaning something different from one chart to the other, even though this is in the same picture. So when you're using things like colors, or when you're using, slightly more complex graphing techniques, make sure that what you're doing is actually serving the point, and it's actually benefiting the person using it, and not working to their detriment or not confusing the issue. This is even worse. So this is from the same report. So the job market is better, worse, or the same. Unemployment a year from today will be higher. I'm guessing this means percentage of people in each of these categories that would say, yes, I think that a year from today, unemployment will be higher, although that's fairly unclear. I don't know if they had like the intern do this or something. I don't know, but I was really surprised to see this report. And here we see that we have this kind of pie graph type of picture, but it's like concentric rings. And the concentric rings represent different age groups. So we see age 18 to 39. It seems like about half of them think the job market is, I'm guessing, the same as a year ago. And about a quarter think it's better, and a quarter think it's worse than, say, something like a year ago. We see age 40 to 64 and age 65 plus. The green, the same, is about the same. But because it's a little hard to see what proportion of them relative to the younger folks think it's worse, because the kind of worse slice starts and ends at different places. There's no real alignment to that slice. Really hard to understand this graph. I mean, I suppose we could, maybe make sense of it if we looked and said, okay, the middle-aged folks, fewer of them seem to think it's better, more of them seem to think it's the same, so maybe worse is about the same, right? But just something like a column graph with multiple columns would have worked much, much better here. So somebody, got a new program or found a new setting in Excel and decided to go kind of crazy. The other issue is that when we come over here in the bar chart, now different colors separate age groups, where over here, different colors separated better, worse, or the same. Again, if your graphical technique makes things more confusing than just giving people the numbers, that's probably not the best use of a graphical technique. The goal of a graphical technique is to take 2,000 numbers and make it easy for somebody to understand and digest very quickly and glean information and knowledge from very quickly. So something like this is a good use of a graphical technique. Something like this, maybe not such a good use. My general recommendation is to stick with simpler graphical techniques. Simpler is almost always better. So rather than a concentric ring pie chart that can be really hard to interpret, just something like a histogram where we have, say, for different age groups, whatever, say same, worse, or better. For different age groups, we can make the age groups color coded. So maybe black is the younger folks, blue is the middle-aged folks, and green is the older folks, right? Something like this is much clearer, I think, than that concentric ring pie chart. But sometimes it can be tempting to play with all of the little options that the technology gives you these days. So another little joke graph, the percentage of the pie chart which resembles Pac-Man is in yellow. Something that I think we probably see often, but is a lot of times not really talked about a whole lot, maybe because it's a little bit of a pain to do in Excel, is something like a heat map here. You have to use kind of the conditional formatting stuff and all of that, but I think heat maps, when they're properly used, are extremely helpful. We saw kind of an example of a heat map all the way back when we were talking about histograms, when we were looking at the country and the percent change in population for each of 10 years for each of the states. We saw that the darker red or the dark blue was really easy to pick out in that graph, and we gleaned a lot of information from that, I think. So that actually was kind of a histogram mixed with a heat map. So what is a heat map? It's when the value of the data point is given a different color depending on, say, the intensity or the number. So in this case, we have a monopoly payback period analysis. So this is looking at, if I spend the money to buy a property or to maybe put a house or a hotel on a property, how many, on average, opponent turns does it take for me to recoup that investment? So there's no, in a payback period analysis, there's no time value of money taken into consideration. There's no economic value added taken into consideration. You're just looking at, for this cash outlay, if this generates per time period this cash inflow, how long does it take for that inflow to equal the outlay? And we see, for instance, if we buy Mediterranean or Baltic as a single property, it takes on average 1,000 opponent rolls to make our money back. On the other hand, if we built a third house on, Connecticut Avenue or Connecticut Street, whichever one it is, it only takes about 11 or 12 on average opponent rolls for us to recoup that investment. And by setting this up so that lower numbers, so fewer opponent rolls, that's more beneficial to me buying that property or that house or hotel. Those are darker red, and more opponent rolls, so taking more time for me to recoup my investment, is darker blue. I can pick out pretty quickly here that these kind of orange and red areas are the profitable ones. So I'd probably prefer to get a monopoly, to get 2 or 3 properties, and then be able to build houses and get up to my third or fourth house, where I can start really making money on my investments. I'd probably prefer to build third houses, or in some cases fourth houses or hotels, or to get, say, all 4 railroads. I'd really prefer that to something like buying a bunch of properties all over the board. So this might help me to understand what strategies are best. I might avoid the utilities. They don't seem all that beneficial, right? Now, that's not to say that the only thing I should worry about is payback period, but this might be one component of a strategy that I might use. Another example is the Index of Economic Freedom published by the Heritage Foundation. So again, talking about kind of objectivity versus subjectivity, this is probably something that's a bit more subjective. It's an assessment of each country's, quote, economic freedom based on some metrics, but obviously there's going to be some subjectivity in which metrics are included, which ones are weighted more or less heavily, and even the evaluation of those metrics. So, but again, it's on a heat map. The more dark green a country is, the more free it is, according to this, economically free it is, according to this metric, and the darker red it is, the less economically free it is. And then, of course, there are some gray areas where there wasn't enough information to make the call. And we also see this this chart, annual mean wage of registered nurses, state by state. This is from 2021, and this is published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And we look at our legend and we see that darker blue corresponds to higher wages and lighter blue corresponds to lower wages. And we can see that kind of just at a glance, we tend to see that the coasts, the West Coast, the East Coast, as well as Alaska and Hawaii, seem to have very high wages for registered nurses, and kind of the Midwest maybe on the lower end of the scale. Now, does this mean that if you graduate with a nursing degree, you should go to New York or California or Hawaii? Is there anything else that I would want to consider here? So I might also want to consider that it's a lot more expensive to live in California, New York, Hawaii than it is to, say, live in, Arkansas or Missouri. So cost of living is something that I'd want to balance this with, right? I might be using something like an inconsistent unit here when I'm just looking at this picture as it is. So maybe a better picture would be something like annual mean wage controlling for cost of living. So take each state's cost of living index and divide the mean wage by that number, and then make this graph again, and it might look a little different. It might look similar, it might look different, but that might be something that would control for that kind of inconsistent unit. The idea that a loaf of bread or a 2,000 square foot house doesn't cost the same amount of money in New York City as it does in Kansas City. Okay, so getting towards the end of the slideshow here, we have scatter plots. So everything we looked at up till now we were representing, say, one variable using a graph. Maybe income, maybe age at death. Can't seem to scroll up. There we go. Maybe the roll of a six-sided die. Maybe height, right? All of these where I pick a variable, I go out, I get a sample, I get some measurements, I construct a graph, and then I, maybe make a histogram or a pie chart or something like that for that one variable. A scatter plot is different in that it compares two variables. So the kind of canonical example here is, say, a person's height versus their weight. So up here, what would my frequency distribution, or what would my, let's say, even raw data look like? I'd have person one's income, person two's income. It would just be a list of numbers representing different incomes of different people in the sample. What would my raw data down here look like? It's very important that this is paired data. I'm not going out and taking 100 people and measuring 100 heights, and then going out the next day and taking 100 different people and measuring 100 weights and then doing something with them. I have person number 1, 2, 3, down to, let's say, 100. I have that person's height and that person's weight. So person 1, I measure their height and I measure their weight. Person 2, I measure their height and their weight. And I keep these attached to one another. So this isn't like 100 random heights and then 100 random weights. It's 100 random people. For each person, I get their height and their weight. So those heights and weights are attached to one another. So I can think of this as an ordered pair, x comma y, like in a Cartesian coordinate system. So I could say, okay, this person had this height and this weight. So person 1 is represented by this point in this two-dimensional plane. Maybe person 2 had this height and this weight. Person 2 is represented by that point. Person 3, person 4, and so on. And I end up with what we call a scatter plot. Each of these points represents a person and their height and weight. So the scatter plot helps me identify relationships between two variables, height and weight in this case, or different variables in other cases. In other words, I might look at this and I might realize that this kind of blob tends to kind of point from the bottom left to the top right. It tends to go in that direction. Or maybe I would glean from this, maybe I would guess that, okay, if I know that a person has a higher height, I would guess they have a higher weight, and vice versa. If I knew that they had a higher weight, I would guess they have a higher height, that they're a taller person. That's not always the case, but maybe kind of in general or on average as a model, maybe that would be something that I could glean from this data set. So here's an example for the medical folks. So these scatter plots, there are 4 on this page. These are from a flow cytometer. And what a flow cytometer does is it's kind of this long tube, and it takes individual cells and passes them down this tube where there's a laser that kind of shines onto the cell. And if we imagine what a cell looks like, we kind of usually think of a cell as just being like a smooth ball, like a beach ball or something, but really cells are kind of fuzzy. They have all these little like proteins hanging off the side that do all kinds of important things, that let things go into or out of the cell, or that signaling molecules latch onto and tell the cell to do certain things, to grow or stop growing or whatever. And what the flow cytometer does is, well, not what's done in advance of putting it through the flow cytometer is these cells are washed in antibodies that attach to some of these proteins, certain ones, and these antibodies have a little fluorescent thing on them. So when this antibody gets hit with a laser, it will fluoresce a certain color or in a certain wavelength of light. So when we see something like CD19, this is a cluster of differentiation, number 19. It's just, certain proteins get called CD19. They're in that group. And if I put certain antibodies in with those cells that attach to the CD19 type proteins, if there are a bunch of those proteins on the surface of the cell, a bunch of those antibodies will attach. When the cell passes by the laser, you'll see that wavelength, light up on the sensor on the other side. So that's what this is. And they use this to do things like try to figure out if they think a person has leukemia or something like that, or maybe whether they're HIV positive or have a lot of extra CD4 or 3 or 8 positive cells floating around. So this is kind of what these are representing. Now there are a lot of these CD markers. So there's over here we have let's say cell number 1. This is cell number 1. It's going to have some value, some intensity on this sensor from the fluorophore, from the color that's associated with CD13. That's going to have a CD13 number. Wrote that a little too low. Cell number 1 has a certain number for certain intensity for CD13. That cell also has a certain intensity for CD19, for CD34, and so on. There's also forward scattering and side scattering, just how complex the cell is. Like if it's a red blood cell that doesn't have a nucleus, the laser will just kind of go straight through it, certain wavelengths that don't interact with these guys. Or if it's very complex, if it's, say a white blood cell that has a big nucleus, then the laser tends to get bounced off to the side instead of going straight through. So that's what these forward scatter and light scatter, or forward scatter and side scatter represent. So we can see that this machine collects a ton of data. For each cell that goes through, it collects all of these CD markers, forward scatter, side scatter, all those kind of things. And we can also see that there are a ton of cells that go through. Every one of these little tiny dots on each of these scatter plots is a different cell. So we're putting through, tens of thousands of cells, or at least thousands of cells. And each one of those cells is generating a ton of data. So how do we analyze that data? Well, we plot it on scatter plots. I can't make a scatter plot if I, collected 20 pieces of data for each cell. I can't make a 20-dimensional scatter plot, right? At best, maybe I could do 3-dimensional, but that would be really hard to view on a computer. So I pick out 2 of these, maybe CD13 against CD34, pair those together, and I get this bottom left scatter plot. And maybe this tells the pathologist something, maybe this tells the oncologist something, says that, oh, okay, I think that, on the basis of this scatter plot, maybe you don't have leukemia, or on the basis of another scatter plot, maybe that puts your disease into a certain other type of, maybe that constrains what diseases it could be. Maybe that gives them some more information for their differential diagnosis, or maybe that informs the treatment options. Maybe they say this treatment I think will work better on the basis of this protein being on the surface of the cell than maybe some other treatment. So if you're interested in this stuff, look up flow cytometer. It's if you're interested in medicine, or particularly hematology, or blood cancers, or any of that, super interesting instrument and super interesting field. And this is just a similar example. Here we have CD3, 4, and 8, the kind of important immune cells. So maybe this person is being tested for whether they have an HIV exacerbation or not. One thing we see up here is if I look at forward scatter versus side scatter in this bottom left, it's just kind of a dark black blob. Are there a lot of cells there, or is there an absolute ton of cells there? A little hard to tell. What's nice about this is that we've combined the idea of a scatter plot and a heat map. When there are more dots close together, when there are more cells that are expressing, say, CD4 and CD8 at a similar intensity as one another, then not only are they close together kind of geographically in a sense in this picture, but when there are more of them that are close together, it turns a color that's closer to red. So from blue to green to yellow to red is greater intensity. So I can tell, okay, like down here in the bottom left, there's a lot of cells, but on the top left, there's an absolute ton of cells, right? This green versus the red. There's a lot of cells in this blob down here, but there's a ton of cells in that red blob up there. And maybe that's informative to the pathologist who's looking at this, and they can make a call on the person's disease status. We could also have a picture like this. This is from that Stanton Glantz primer and biostatistics book. Or what's not directly from the book. He references this study in the book. So I grabbed this from the original paper. And this is the relationship between muscle cross-sectional area, so how big somebody's forearm muscles are, versus grip strength in normal subjects who are denoted with a triangle, and patients with rheumatoid arthritis denoted by a diamond. Unfortunately, triangle versus diamond, especially in a paper from a few decades ago where the printing quality wasn't all that great, can be a little bit hard to tell what's what here, especially like kind of in the bottom left here. But we can kind of see that if we look at the kind of top right, we can see most of those are triangles on the top right. And if we look at the bottom right-ish side of the screen, we can see that most of those, I mean, there's a triangle here or there, but most of those are diamonds. So I can see that for a given cross-sectional area of muscle, for a given muscle mass, basically, the people that are, quote, normal, that don't have RA, have a much higher grip strength than the people that do have RA. And grip strength is important for activities of daily living, being able to, pull yourself up out of a seat or something like that, or if you start to fall over, being able to grab something and catch yourself and stop yourself falling over, or just do something like pick up a thing of milk and pour it or something. So grip strength, super important for connecting, all of our musculature to the things that we probably want to do in life. And we can see, that RA is going to be pretty devastating in the ability to grip things and hold on to them strongly. So even if a person has good muscle mass, that joint issue can really impair them. These two lines here, up here, I kind of drew this green line. I could think of a model. I could ask myself, is there a linear model? Is there a straight line that I could draw through this data that would kind of do a good job of modeling the data? This one, probably not a good job at all. Oops. I undid and it brought me all the way down to the bottom. So this one, probably not a good model at all. This one may be a little better of a model, but maybe a model like this straight line seems to be pretty close to most of the data points. That's probably a good model. And that's what they've done here, is this top line with the higher slope is the model if we kind of imagine getting rid of all the diamonds and just having the triangles just for the normal non-RA folks. If they increase muscle mass by, say, 10 square centimeters, muscle area, cross-sectional area, by, say, 10 square centimeters, what does it look like their increase in grip strength in terms of newtons is? It looks like, I don't know, maybe 100-ish newtons. So going from, say, 20 to 30 square centimeters in cross-sectional area, looks like it goes from maybe 150 to 250 or so newtons in grip strength, ballpark. But for the folks with RA, which is the lower slope line down here, going from 20 to 30, takes them from like 50 to maybe 75 or 100 newtons of grip strength, right? So that 10 units increase in cross-sectional area only yielded maybe something like a 25 or 50 unit increase in grip strength rather than the 100 unit increase in grip strength for the non-RA folks. So again, more things we can do with scatter plots. We can use color. We can use different types of points instead of just drawing all little circular points. We could use, squares or triangles or diamonds or something to differentiate different groups of folks if I want a different strata represented on the same picture. Are there any questions to this point? Okay, we've got about 20 minutes. I think we can get through, yeah, I think we're going to come back to log and semi-log. I want to write myself a little note here. We'll come back to log and semi-log plots just because it's a little bit of a tangential topic and it requires a little bit of mathematical background. If you've seen logarithms before, if you want to just really quickly brush up on them before next time, that's fine. If you don't know what a logarithm is or you haven't seen them before, you can look into them, but the mathematical background isn't strictly necessary. We will talk about it a little bit because it does come up in medicine and in finance, and I know a lot of you are interested in those fields. Also in computer science a bit. But we won't spend a ton of time on it, and understanding that background isn't super important. But if you want to understand the next lecture, this little component a little more, you can brush up on logarithms if you feel like it. But I think in the next 20 minutes, we'll try to knock out these last bit of slides on misleading graphs, and we'll save those log and semi-log plots for next time. And so again, just like when I mentioned misuse of statistics at the end of chapter 1, if somebody presents a misleading graph, that's not saying that they're being malevolent. They could be intentionally trying to mislead you, but it could just be a mistake. So, two things about that. If you see a misleading graph, don't think, oh, that person's a jerk. They might have just made a mistake. But also don't say, oh, because I have confidence in this person, because I know that they're not a jerk, then all of their graphs are not misleading. That's not a true statement either. If I know that this person is not intentionally trying to mislead me, they could have made a mistake and presented a graph that is misleading. So a couple examples here, and I have a couple more in a different document. If I look at this and I see revenue for Apple and Microsoft, I say, wow, Microsoft blew Apple out of the water, right? There's no question. Microsoft has a way bigger revenue than Apple until I look at the scale over here. I started to scale it. This is in millions of dollars. So 65,000 million, 65 billion, going up to 71 billion. That's a very strange scale to use. In particular, it's a strange scale because revenue, in other words, essentially the dollars of income that the company brought in. Now, for folks in finance or accounting, it's not net income, so I'm using income very loosely here, but the amount of something like sales or the overall dollars taken in before you do things like worry about how much expenses were and all that. Well, this is a ratio measurement, right? It has a true zero. If I didn't bring in any money this year, I had no revenue. I would measure zero revenue. It has a true zero. Or if one company brought in 10 billion and another company brought in 20 billion, the 20 billion company brought in twice the amount of revenue as the 10 billion. This is on a ratio scale. It has a true zero. I probably ought to start my graph at zero then. This is a much more faithful representation of the data. I'm starting my graph at zero, and this graph tells a very different story than this one, right? Just changing that y-axis scale and making it start at zero comes up with a completely different graph. I mean, they're both right in a sense. You know, the user who was being extra careful and cautious would carefully read that scale on the left and, you know, before they make any judgment. But kind of the purpose of a graphical technique is to allow somebody to make an accurate judgment quickly. So we ought to, you know, aid them in doing that. Even worse is the ones that do this and then they don't put the scale on. I think that's pretty intentionally misleading. You know, some of those advertisements for crazy stuff. But yeah, so with ratio data, there's a true zero. We probably ought to start our graph at zero then to respect that true zero. That keeps the ratio aspect, the 2-to-1, you know, 5-to-1 kind of ratio feel that translates that over to the bars as well, right? If one company had twice the revenue of another, that company's bar would be twice the height of the other. Where over here, that ratio aspect is really lost. That additional structure is really lost. Now, something like, say, if you were reporting temperature data in degrees Fahrenheit, I mean, that's not a true zero. 0 degrees Fahrenheit is just kind of a stake we set in the ground and we measure forwards and backwards from there. So it's going to be much less of an issue to start your scale at 60 degrees or 30 degrees or something if we're representing degrees Fahrenheit, because there's no real ratio aspect to begin with. There's no true zero to begin with. So, you know, starting at zero is not nearly as, not even not nearly as important. It's not important at all. I saw this picture. I thought it was a really nice graphic in an article I was reading, and top 10 most read books in the world. And this is what it looks like. And you say, okay, looks like the Bible was read at about twice the frequency of everything else. And that quotations from Mao and Harry Potter are a little more than everything else. And everything else is about the same. All these other ones that are listed here. Well, that is until you look at the scale. And to be fair, like they did have the scale on here and these numbers. But again, the purpose of a graphical technique should be to make the data easier to digest rather than making it confusing, right? That seems the numbers are saying one thing and the picture saying another, and you have to figure out what's going on here. And really the problem is here is just the opposite of the last one. They set the 0 point kind of like at the top of the titles of the books. So you can see like the Dyer Van Frank over here at 27 is like this little tiny smidge of red that's above that top of that book, but the Bible is up here at 3,900. Right. So here we have, instead of kind of missing a big chunk of our bar, we have kind of like a big extra chunk of bar added on to everybody. So again, you know, number of copies of the book sold over the last 50 years, that's ratio data. It has a true zero, but our zero isn't at the bottom of the bar. In this case, it's like halfway up the bar, or in some of these cases, you know, a lot more than halfway up the bar. Again, very misleading. Now, okay, you can look at the numbers, but then what's the point of having the graph, right? If it's misleading like this. I mean, it's a pretty looking graph, but it's just confusing. Another example is misleading by kind of perception, by the way that people tend to perceive things. We tend to look at areas in two-dimensional shapes rather than, you know, single distances, rather than a vertical or horizontal distance component. So if I said something like I doubled my sales from 2014 to 2015, and I use a circle with a diameter of, say, 30 units for year one and a diameter of 60 units for year two, that would probably mislead a reader. I mean, we can see that we actually did just double the diameter, but the problem is the area is pi r squared. By doubling the diameter, we double the radius. That's the same thing, but this 2 gets squared. Our area gets multiplied by 4, not by 2. So a person looking at this is going to just kind of naturally perceive, if you say how much better they do in year 2 than year 1, they're probably going to think a lot better than twice as good. I've talked a little bit about time series issues already. So there are things like autocorrelation and so on. But here's a graph again from a previous textbook that we used for the course, maybe 8 or 10 years ago. So this is from that book, and I've kind of recreated the graph so it's not quite as detailed as the original one, but it's pretty faithful to the original one. So this is leading causes of death for men 25 to 44 years old from 1984 to 1994. And some things we see about this graph that are interesting are cancer actually increased as a cause of death. That might be strange because we might think that we should have gotten better at treating cancer and it should have gone down. We see HIV increased a ton. So if I have a graph like this, especially in time series, especially when I'm reporting the same measurement over a span of like 10 years, well, did HIV really start killing people to this extent, all of a sudden over these 10 years? Or did we get better at testing for it and start testing for it more and realize it was killing people? Maybe in the earlier side of this time frame, we were saying, oh, the person died of an infection and we're not sure why. And then near the later end, when people were getting tested more and diagnosed more, maybe we knew the root cause. And same thing with cancer, right? Detection is getting better, treatment is getting better, but if detection gets better faster than treatment, we can attribute the kind of quote natural causes deaths maybe to cancer in some cases in 1994, where they would have been attributed to just natural causes in other cases. On the other hand, things like detecting a death from heart disease, if somebody has a heart attack, those symptoms are pretty clear. We understood what symptoms of heart attacks were pretty well in 1984. So that's something where there's less of a detection bias. And we do see that rate going down a little bit over those 10 years, probably because we were getting better at treating heart attacks, getting better at bringing people back, and so on. Strokes are about flat. Again, pretty easy to diagnose a stroke. Accidents went way down. Again, much easier to detect an accident, a death from an accident, than say a death from cancer. It's usually pretty clear when somebody dies from an accident. But we kind of went more away from, say, manufacturing and heavy industry jobs. We sent those jobs overseas and we went more towards the service industry. So the number of accidents, number of deaths from accidents went down, but we didn't get any better at detecting them. As we were, over this 10 years, we were probably equally good at detecting deaths from accidents. So we see that number going way down. So that's just another example of something that can happen over the span of, several years, a decade, a couple of decades, is our ability to detect, death from a certain cause probably changed quite a bit. And that muddies the waters, right? That's not to say that, so if we got better at detecting cancer and better at treating cancer, I don't know, did we get really good at detecting cancer and pretty good at treating it? Did we get a little better at detecting it and no better at treating it, right? It's not clear, right? For HIV, did we get a ton better at detecting it and the same number of people died from it in 84 and 94, and we just got better at accurately reporting that? Or did actually a lot more people die in 94 than 84 from HIV, and we had the same level of detection that whole time? Again, it's hard to tell, and this is one of the reasons that time series can be fairly challenging, can be very challenging. Or in the finance world, every time that there's big bubble and crash, well, you might say, well, just look back to the last 10 crashes and try to extrapolate from there and guess what's going to happen next. But every time we have a big bubble and crash, the regulators come in and say, oh, this is really bad. And they're, I'm not saying that it's not bad or that it's good or anything, but they come in and they say, this is really bad. We need to do something. And they kind of like change the rules. They change, these days, if the market's starting to crash too much, they like pause trading. They didn't used to do that. So in a sense, every crash is different from all the others because every time one happens, they kind of change up the rules, and then it makes it harder to model the next one because the rules are different. So there are pluses and minuses to adding those rules. If the rules work and stop crashes, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe some economists would argue long term it's not such a great thing, but certainly for societal stability, it's probably in the right direction. Some other misleading graphs. A lot of times, if you try to get too complicated with the type of graph you're using, it makes it more misleading. So this is an example from a well-known pathology textbook, Robbins Pathology. And you can see that we have this like 3D histogram here. This is something like 5-year risk for future heart attack and stroke for people either who have no prior MI, no prior heart attack versus a prior heart attack, or people who are diabetics versus non-diabetics. So this blue on the left is no prior heart attack, non-diabetic. The red on the left is diabetic, no prior heart attack. Blue on the right is non-diabetic with a prior heart attack. We can see those blocks are about the same height, those two middle ones. And then diabetics with a prior heart attack, much higher. But it kind of looks like this blue on the left here, it looks like it's at 0. If I look where it lines up with that index on the back, it looks like it's at 0. And I looked at this and I found it very strange because it seems to line up with the index 0 on the back. But if you look at the block, it seems to have some height in the front. It's kind of odd, right? But if we look carefully, there's a parallax issue here. These bars are not pushed all the way to the back wall. They're brought forward. And we're looking at it from the top right. So kind of like when you look at a clock from the side, or you look at, you're in the passenger seat and you look at how fast somebody's going on the speedometer, it doesn't quite read correctly. So we really see that this non-diabetics with no prior MI should be at 2. We also see that the others should be at 15 and 16, those middle blocks. And it looks like they're, well below 15. So if we set what's called the gap depth to 0, pushing those blocks against the back, we get a more accurate representation of the data. But again, why use some kind of 3D with perspective plot when you could just use the 2D, wrong window, when you could just use the 2D bar chart like this, and there are no additional problems with perspective or any of that, right? Again, I always default to just the simplest, straightforward, like 2-dimensional, no fancy 3D stuff or anything like that, because it's usually the better representation of the data. It might not look as artistic, but the goal is to present data in an accurate and faithful way. That should really be the priority. If you want to be artistic, draw a picture off to the side or something. I don't know. But usually the more bland the graphical representation is, the more accurate it's going to be. Just because there aren't things, and I mean, you can fix it, right? You can make it work. But if you forget to do that, or if you don't realize you need to do that, it's easy to make a misleading graph. So some references here. Are there any questions on anything from today?